Mike Waltz is a retired colonel in the National Guard, a combat-decorated Green Beret, a former White House and Pentagon policy advisor, businessman, and author. Elected in 2018 in Florida's 6th Congressional District, Congressman Waltz quickly rose the ranks, especially in the areas of foreign policy and defense. I'm also joined by Chrissy Houlahan. She is an Air Force veteran, engineer, entrepreneur, and educator who was elected to represent Pennsylvania's 6th District in 2018. Representative Houlahan is a member of the Armed Services Committee and the powerful Select Committee on Intelligence. Thank you both very, very much for being with me today.
Thank you for having me.
You both wrapped up a fantastic session, a conversation, and I want to go right to foreign policy. First big question, we're almost to the election. How do you see foreign policy playing a role right now in this presidential election? Congressman, we'll start with you.
Well, foreign policy, the details of the policy and the eaches, we don't ever really see, in my view at least, front and center on people's minds. It's much more economy, inflation, immigration. However, I do think it plays into this kind of notion of, did we have peace or do we have chaos? Do we have strength or do we have weakness, and an overall sense of security abroad for most of our voters? I mean, Chrissy, of course, could disagree. I do think also that when you have key flashpoint moments, like Gaza, like the war in Ukraine, people are looking to not just a president, but a commander-in-chief and how they deal with that. So I think all of that's factoring in, but I do think it will be below the core kind of kitchen table issues that typically determine elections.
Does that make it particularly difficult when it comes to developing policy?
So I would largely agree with Mike in terms of, kind of where it falls. It's probably below the fold if you had to ask people, to enumerate their issues. But I think that because of things like COVID, because of things like Gaza and Ukraine, and, to some degree what's going on in Taiwan, people over the last 5 or 6 years since we've come into Congress have become much more acutely aware of how we are part of that global ecosystem in a way that the first, couple years when I was running for Congress, I would never have heard anybody bring up anything that would be global or international or foreign. I think that people now recognize that we can't have healthcare, jobs, environment, economy in many ways if we don't have security, if we don't have peace. And I think that we understand in a better way than we had before how we're part of that and how we need to play a leading role in that.
So let's talk then specifically to Ukraine. Do we have an objective? What's the end goal for us in Ukraine?
So I would say, and this again, Mike would maybe disagree, my goal, and I hope that I'm representing the folks in my community and the folks in our Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and the country, is to allow Ukraine to have its sovereignty back in under whatever conditions that is appropriate in terms of a peace negotiation that is led by Ukraine and by Russia, I suppose, as the other part of the conversation. I think that it looks like a peace on the continent of Europe, and it looks like the United States showing our power, our strength, so that other people, perhaps President Xi as an example, don't see this as a weakness or a vulnerability on the global stage and something that they can take advantage of in future years.
So, Congressman, how do you see NATO and their central role with Ukraine today, and what are your views of Ukraine becoming a member of NATO?
Yeah, well, and just to add to what Chrissy was saying, I'm glad to hear kind of thought leaders on national security like her talking about at least entering into the conversation some type of negotiated solution. What we've heard from the administration is just as long as it takes, and I think that's a great slogan. That's not a strategy. Stopping Putin from taking Kyiv, I think, has been accomplished, one. His military has been devastated, although he's trying to rebuild. Two, I find it practical and realistic to think that the EU, with the same size economy as the United States, and NATO, with 30 modern militaries, can continue to support Ukraine and take much more over time of a share of that burden, particularly as the United States needs to get past the slogan and actually pivot to the Pacific and focus on what is, I think, the greatest adversary the United States has ever faced in the Communist Party of China. So we need to expect and see plans for all NATO members to hit the minimum of 2%. and then start celebrating those like Poland and the Baltics that are investing 3, 4, 5%. I mean,
recently, I think they're shooting for 6%.
yeah, right. I mean, if you've got the largest war since World War II on their doorstep, the fact that you still have some large economies in Europe like Spain, France, and Italy, and to some extent even Germany, not making those long-term investments, to me is fantastical. We should expect that of them and demand that of them.
So you talk about China, and I want to talk about this. It feels that over the last 6, 7, 8 years, there's been this seismic shift in how we talk about China. Before, maybe we talked about China as if they were 10 feet tall. Now, it seems it's a really different conversation, but maybe to some extent bipartisan in terms of U.S. View on China right now.
Well, you're seeing, I mean, we are literally living through the largest military buildup in the world since Germany in the 1930s. You're seeing China on track to not double, but triple its nuclear arsenal by the end of this decade to begin getting on parity with the United States and Russia. In 2019, they launched more into space than the rest of the world combined. Their Navy is now larger than the United States Navy, but they have the luxury of concentrating them in the Western Pacific. Our now smaller Navy is spread literally all over the world, and we're seeing this kind of gray zone hybrid aggression like you're seeing against the Philippines in the South China Sea. And look, when you're talking about upwards of 70% of the world's largest container ships flowing through there, when you're talking 50% of global GDP, this is incredibly serious. And I believe Xi, when he tells the 20th Party Congress that he will settle the Taiwan issue with force if necessary, those are his words, on his watch. Well, the man's 70, so, you know.
I also believe that. And this is another place where I think we have the advantage. I hope we have the advantage of the American people having been through, in the last 5 or 6 years, some shocks to our infrastructure, which has allowed them to more acutely understand how dependent we are on those shipping channels, how dependent we are on manufacturing in places like China, how much we need to sort of separate ourselves from that. We need to have those conversations not just with the American people, but with industry as well. And I think that's something that, thankfully, in some bad, sick, twisted way, we were able to understand acutely because of what happened with COVID, because of the shipping lanes in terms of Ukraine and in the Middle East as well. So I think we're a much more sophisticated group of people in terms of our conversations than we were just a few years ago.
And in one area, and I would just add to that, I think one area of bipartisan agreement was President Trump revived the Quad, and President Biden has built on that Quad, including, and
also NATO is starting to understand their role in the Indo-Pacific as well. So there's a good thing going on in terms of the blur of alliances and partnerships across the world, not just isolated to theaters, which I think is important.
When is that pivot going to happen? If you look at our coverage, if you look at, frankly, what seems to be the majority of our time, it's focused on the Middle East and focused on Ukraine. So when is that pivot, or how is that pivot?
One of my frustrations with what I believe is a failed Iran policy is we're literally pulling aircraft carriers and ships out of the Pacific and putting them back into the Gulf and in the Red Sea, for that matter. Those missiles, those $2 to $3 million missiles that we're firing at $50,000 Iranian drones, we will need in the Pacific, and the state of our industrial base, we can't replace them quickly. So I think right now China is getting cheap, illegal Iranian oil and watching our forces once again get sucked into the Middle East. I think a lot of this can be solved with better sanctions and more pressure on the Iranian economy that will free those forces up to get back into the Pacific.
I think you are seeing the pivot and I think it's a bipartisan one in the sense that both Mike and I serve on the Armed Services Committee. We both serve on the Intel Committee. He's fortunate enough to still be on the Foreign Affairs Committee. I had to give that one up because of party issues.
Yeah.
But I think what we all know is how important this is and investing in that region is. And you're seeing that reflected in the Armed Services Bill that we pass every year, the NDAA. You're also seeing it on foreign affairs as well. So I don't think that this is a partisan issue. I think this is something that we all can agree on. how we do the pivot, I think, is how we, may agree to disagree.
And it sometimes can be hard to have a longer view, especially when you've got Houthi rebels essentially ruining. Sorry,
Backed by Iran.
Backed by Iran, but from a trade route perspective, look at the resources we've got to put in there just to keep things flowing. Let's talk about Israel if we can. It's been a rather significant couple days, especially with Lebanon. And where do you see the U.S. really leading right now? And do you expect some sort of potential surprise ceasefire, or where do you see this going currently?
I was frustrated yesterday on Meet the Press, I believe it was. President Herzog had quite a long interview, and one of the things that he said is that we're caught in this vicious circle, and so what's left is escalation. And that to me sort of felt like counterintuitive. It feels like that he and Israel and we have the ability to de-escalate and to seek peace and seek negotiations. And I believe that we do need to return the hostages. And I believe all of the things that Israel is saying in terms of the necessity for self-defense and making sure that, that they are protected. But I also think if we continue collectively, Hamas and Hezbollah and Israel and everybody, to escalate, we will inevitably end up in a broader war, and that worries me.
So again, I think this is an area where we have, of course, common goals in restoring stability and getting our people out and disagree on how to get there. I think the administration has focused on a ceasefire in Gaza and moderating the Israeli approach as the center of gravity. I believe that you will never have peace in the Middle East as long as Iran is flush with cash, because they do not want peace. They do not want a two-state solution. They do not want Israel, frankly, to even exist. So I think Tehran is the key to peace in the Levant, not in the Levant itself. And look, I just take a different view. Taking Hania off the battlefield in the downtown Tehran green zone, completely decimating Hezbollah's leadership, taking out key leaders in Syria, actually has a deterrent effect when it comes to terrorist groups like Hamas and like Hezbollah. So I think that strength has to be projected, and consequences. And my question I continue to ask: what consequences has Iran suffered for trying to assassinate our political leader, for launching missiles directly off of its soil at Israel, for shutting down international shipping in the Red Sea through its proxy? None. They haven't suffered any consequence. So I just think the focus is misplaced. And even if we get a ceasefire tomorrow, and I pray we do and get our people out, Hamas and Iran have made it clear more October 7th are on the horizon as long as they're allowed to support it.
Do you see potential further implementation of the Abraham Accords at this time, or coming up at any point, or do you think it's off the table?
Well, I think historians will look back at the interview that Bret Baier did with Mohammed bin Salman, and when he said Israel and Saudi Arabia are this close, and both sides desperately want it. We heard that directly from Bibi Netanyahu's mouth. It was his top priority. And I think that was when Iran saw that as an existential threat and lit the match that set the Middle East on fire at this point.
Let's shift and talk a little bit about the Global South. There are a number of leaders here from Africa, from Latin America, and the Caribbean. And there's one common reference when they're asked about the United States, which is the United States isn't there.
Yeah.
How do you balance all of these significant competing issues while not ignoring what's happening today in the Global South? And I would also love to ask you both specifically about Venezuela and where you see the U.S. playing a role in a potential next step in Venezuela.
It is hard, and I can speak just from the perspective of a member of Congress and the schedules that we run. We need to make sure that we're paying a lot more attention to the Global South. And I think, at least in the last couple of years, I've seen that on both sides of the aisle. I myself am leaving for Colombia and Argentina, I think, in another 3 days. And so I think we are trying to make sure that people understand that we're present. We're making sure that we're listening and understanding what the challenges are of the region. But there's a lot of work to do and a lot of kind of not bad blood, but sort of we haven't been present as much as we need to be able to understand what's going on in places like Latin America. We disagree on how we think about our southern border in terms of what we need to do to be able to stop the flow of people across our border. I think it needs to be a focus on that. Maybe we don't disagree on the Northern Triangle area, and that means that we need to be present, a lot more than we are. I'm
the Republican co-chair of the India caucus. I think that is the most consequential relationship of the 21st century, the world's oldest and now largest democracies.
More so than China.
Oh, absolutely. As long as she is taking China more and more into a techno-surveillance state and walking away from where China was just a decade ago in terms of free market economies and reforms, and that old kind of paradigm that once China liberalizes economically, it will liberalize politically, I think is gone.
Yeah. Under
Xi at least, and that will remain so. So yes, I do think India by far is the most important relationship. And on the Western Hemisphere, if you play out kind of the current state of things, if Europe does what we ask them to do and invest more in the defense and has a greater role its own defense, China continues to pressure Western Asia, I think could see a more regionalized world. The United States has all the energy, food security, critical minerals, resources that we really need in the Western Hemisphere if only we would invest in it in a more meaningful way. So some in kind of my side of things say America first, Western Hem second, and how we secure those supply chains, secure those relationships, and really, kind of play that foreign policy, that new paradigm out of an increasingly multipolar world. So I do think you'll see a bipartisan push. I hope. I don't know if President Biden ever went to South America in the last 4 years. I don't think. But those head of state visits really matter.
They do.
Well, and either way, we should see that.
And one of the other interviews as part of this year's season is with Maria Corina Machado from Venezuela. And do you see any potential for some sort of agreement that could bring about a peaceful transfer of power in Venezuela?
God bless her. She's in hiding. I mean, it's one thing for us to say we value our freedoms. It's another thing to literally put your life and your family's lives on the line. Again, this is where we may disagree on approach. I think a concessions-based, what some would call an appeasement approach to dictators like Maduro will never work. I just passed legislation out of committee, and I hope out of the House, to tighten sanctions once again on Maduro, on the gold, on the oil, and all the illicit activity he's getting from both China and Russia. I think that's the only thing he responds to. And the other, the interesting piece about Central South America is this kind of mini axis of evil between Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba would be either broken if we would support freedom and more aggressively support Machado and Gonzalez in their fight for freedom.
Let's bring this home. Seems to be a rather significant uptick in political violence taking place today. Is this something that you think is here to stay, and what do you see as the root causes of this?
So I serve on the committee, the task force that's about the attempted assassination of President Trump. And I get asked this question a lot about sort of political violence, political rhetoric on the rise, and what can we do to address it. I think one of the most important things that we need to do to address this is to lead by example. Leadership matters, and words from leadership matter. And I think so consistently we need to decry the idea that this is somehow a solution. Political violence in any way, shape, or form is not. And the Democratic Party, the president, the vice president, me, everybody all the way down the line has done that. I know that some members of Congress on the other side as well have done that too. We do need to lower the temperature, and I think that will be helpful. I have hope in the sense that I've watched and listened to a lot of and read a lot of history of kind of the 1930s, 1940s, where there was also a similar kind of escalatory concern, the McCarthy era as an example, and we were able to kind of come back around to a sense of civility and decency and a sense of comedy, together. And so I hope that it is a cyclical thing that we can overcome and that we can conquer by good behavior and good leadership.
Yeah, but I would put it's not just on our elected leaders, I'd put it on the media as well. I mean, that if we had had a few more minutes in our panel, I would have pointed out who got more coverage: us passing bipartisan legislation related to our national security, or some of our colleagues on the oversight committee yelling at each other about their eyelashes and and that kind of nonsense, right? That got a week's worth of kind of clickbait, all eyeballs, ratings. And so I think we need to look at the business model of our media and what incentivizes and what they cover.
And
right? Because then it incentivizes behavior, bad behavior.
And then taking down to the consumer of that media and the person who votes for that person, we need to make sure that our electorate, that our constituents, that our citizenry understands their role in this too. They have to be engaged. They have to be questioning what it is that they're seeing. They have to be willing to have conversations with people they wouldn't normally have conversations with, like actual conversations.
Which is happening though less, especially with social media algorithms.
But it's the individual citizen's responsibility just as much as it is media, just as much as it is.
One of the things she and I, Chrissy and I are both passionate about and believe is not a silver bullet, but would help more veterans in our politics. If we were willing to both die together just a few years ago for the same set of values in that flag, then we can get over whatever partisan differences there are and roll up our sleeves. But even more broadly, getting back to national service. And one of the reasons the Greatest Generation was so great is it was a forcing function. Whether you're from downtown Detroit or a farm boy from Indiana, you all came together for a common cause. And if you couldn't get over your differences, you had a drill sergeant's boot in your rear end. Now, you don't have to wear a uniform to serve. It can be in Teach for America, national parks, elderly care, inner city tutoring.
What does it call for a mandate on national service?
Well, I think we could incentivize it, the bill that we worked on, not a mandate.
We worked collectively on this
if we
together.
talk about just erasing someone's debt for free college, well, let's get a year or two of service for your fellow taxpayer in exchange for their money and to further your education. I think we can more aggressively work on that.
And that is something that we work together on, and I hope to God that we're able to figure out a way to get that through the House, the Senate, and onto the President's desk for signature.
Well, we'll end it there. Representatives Waltz and Houlahan, thank you so much for joining, and thank you for representing that bipartisanship is still alive.
Oh, it is, more so than cable news likes to admit. It is.